This is the new Orbea Oiz that they released early this year, ready for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics that never happened. It's a slight refresh on the previous Oiz with only a couple of alterations, but it's an interesting bike that I've enjoyed riding, so we thought we'd bring you a review here on BikeRadar. Before I get too far into the review though, if you want to look quite as fly as me, head over to freewheel.co.uk. They supplied us with a load of kit for our reviews on BikeRadar. Also, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the BikeRadar channel and click the bell icon so that every time we upload a new video, you get a notification. So the main new thing with this generation Oiz is their use of OMX carbon. Previous generations' top flight bike used OMR, and they also have an alloy version called the Hydro. So OMX is a higher modulus carbon, and this basically means for the same weight it's a bit stiffer, so you can get a slightly lighter frame. And they've made it so that it's 250 grams lighter than the previous generation. That's partly thanks to the OMX carbon, also a slightly more detailed layup of the carbon so there's less overlap between the different sheets of pre-preg carbon, and also a slightly revised rear end that's 5mm shorter and comes with a flat mount rear caliper brake mount. As you might expect from a modern cross-country race bike, it's got 100mm of travel at the front and at the back. On this bike it's controlled with Fox dampers, so it's a Fox 32 fork and a Fox DPS shock at the rear. Now the interesting thing about the suspension on this bike is that they have developed a thing called Squidlock, which is an on-bar 3-position lockout lever. This lets you toggle both fork and shock between open, medium and firm modes. The Squidlock lets you go one position each way at a time. That's relatively unique and actually really useful, and I'll talk about that when we talk about how the Oiz rides. So before I talk about the geometry and the kit on this particular bike, I'll point out a few of the interesting frame details. Now, as with a lot of cross-country lightweight full suspension bikes, there are no rear pivots. That's because the chainstays and seat stays sort of flex to give that little bit of movement that you need for a 4-bar suspension system to work. In the middle of the bike, we've got this fibre link, I think it's called, basically a composite little rocker to help shave a little bit of weight. Within the frame, there's 2 sets of bottle mounts, with the one on the down tube having 2 positions, higher or lower. Now this is super handy for marathon racers who want to carry 2 sets of bottles. If you're going to race short cross country, maybe you'll just keep the one, but it's nice to have that option. Built into the main pivot is a little chain keeper, just to give that little bit of extra security over more technical terrain. Cables run internally throughout the frame as you'd expect, and the cable which actuates the lockout on the shock runs through the top tube and accesses the front of the shock kind of inside a little cubby hole in here. So access isn't the easiest, but it isn't something you should be adjusting too often anyway. Okay, so I don't have all the geometry figures in my head, but I do have BikeRadar.com with an interesting news story on this particular bike. So this is the geometry for a size large with the OMX frame, because don't forget there's a new rear triangle which is slightly shorter with the OMX. So we've got a 69-degree head angle, which isn't the steepest out there, but it's also not the slackest. And we've got a 75-degree seat angle. Again, that's reasonably steep, but it isn't super steep. In terms of reach, you're looking at 456mm for a size large. That is kind of on par with a lot of XC race bikes, but the latest generation of the most radical ones, we're looking at the likes of Specialized and NS, are significantly longer than that. At the back, we've got 430mm chainstays. If you get the OMR or the Hydro frame, those are the 2 lower options, you get 435mm chainstays. So that's the geometry. It isn't the most radical out there, but it also isn't the most conservative. It kind of sits in the middle. Now, there are 15 models of Oiz available across the different frame materials and with the Oiz TR, which is a trail version of this bike. Now that shares the same frame set, but you get a 120mm fork and a longer stroke shock, giving 120mm of rear wheel travel. Obviously the geometry is slightly different between the TR and the normal Oiz, but you can have a look at that online yourself. Now, if we're looking at the models within the XC range, the top one is the Oiz M Limited, and that comes in at £7,699, $8,999 or €8,599. As you'd expect, you get factory level suspension from Fox, you get Access Eagle wireless drivetrains, carbon wheels from DT Swiss. This is the MT model, comes in at £6,299, $7,499 or £6,999. As you can see, again, factory level suspension from Fox, a Shimano XTR drivetrain with XTR brakes, and this is a little extra, a Fox transfer dropper post. Now, this costs an extra £219, and that's available through the Mayo program. So if you go to Orbea's website, you want to go and buy a bike, some of the components have options on there which you can add or remove. This has had the dropper post added for £219 on top of that $6,299 price tag. The other interesting thing about Mayo is that you can change the paint jobs, and this doesn't cost anything, but it will take a couple of weeks for your bike to arrive. But there are literally around 1 million different colour options, which I think is pretty cool. If we want to go all the way down to the entry-level carbon bike, that's the Oiz M30 with the OMR carbon. That comes in at £3,299, $3,799 or €3,599. You get Shimano Dior, you get DT Swiss aluminium wheels and performance level Fox suspension. And just for completeness, we'll look at the entry-level bike, which is the Oiz H30, so that's the hydro aluminium frame set. That comes in at £2,199, $2,599 or €2,399. You get Shimano Dior, you get Orbea branded wheels, aluminium finishing kit and rhythm level suspension from Fox. That's quite a lot in there, but Orbea's website does spell it out pretty well. So those are all the facts, figures, details and everything that you might want to know, but what you really want to know is how does the Oiz actually ride out on the trail? So I've done everything from super short sprinty rides on it all the way up to huge 8 or 9 hour epics on it, and I've actually rather enjoyed riding the Oiz. I don't think it's perfect by any stretch, but I do think it's actually a fairly good option if you're looking for a very lightweight trail bike or cross-country race bike, with a few caveats along the way. The first thing I really noticed about the Oiz was that the rear suspension is very supple, very active, but not in a wallowy, sort of unpleasant, inefficient way, but in a very keeps the rear wheel stuck to the ground, boosting traction and helping you put the power through the rear wheel kind of way. This means that when you are stood up on the pedals and sprinting away in that open mode, the suspension does move around quite a bit. If you're pointing it up a steep technical climb, the rear wheel is very happy bumping up and over rocks and roots, helping maintain that traction. This does mean in theory then that on smoother climbs it's not the most efficient bike out there, especially if you're running sort of relatively soft 20 to 25% sag. However, that's where the Squidlock comes into play. In many ways I would say that the Squidlock defines the Oiz as an XC race and marathon bike. Because it's so easy to toggle between the different modes on the fork and the shock, it's very easy to make sure that you've got the suspension working kind of how you need it for whichever bit of trail you're on. So for example, on a more technical, steep, rooty, rocky climb, you might have it fully open to absolutely maximise the traction available through the rear tyre. On a rough but not completely mad climb, you might well have it in that trail mode. This allows the suspension to bump up and down over those rocks and roots, but also helps keep it fairly firm under those pedalling loads. So it doesn't feel inefficient, but you still get plenty of grip that you want. And then on those smooth climbs or in a sprint, lock it out and you get a very firm suspension feel through the front and the back of the bike. This means it's incredibly efficient. This relates too to those smoother, flatter, more twisty trails that you sometimes find on XC race courses. On a descent, when you might be dealing with more rocks, more roots, bigger impacts, maybe some jumps and some drops, if you do open it out into its fully open mode, as you'd expect to do so, I did find that the rear suspension could have perhaps had a little bit more support. It's fairly easy to get it through towards the end of its travel. It doesn't bottom out harshly, you're not blowing your ankles off the pedals particularly, but a bit more support would help it if you're going to load it into corners along the way. As such, I actually tended to use it in its medium mode quite a lot on descents. Yes, on the roughest of descents, I did open it out just to give that little extra sensitivity. But I would say that probably 75% of the time, I was in that medium mode for most of my mountain biking. As mentioned when I talked about the geometry, it isn't particularly radical, and that has its benefits, but it also has its downsides as well. So where does it work? Well, it is fairly short at 456mm in terms of its reach, and 69 degrees on the head angle isn't particularly slack. On those tight and twisty courses though, what this does mean is that you've got your weight well over the front of the bike. It's very easy to turn, take those sharp corners. On a tighter, more technical climb as well, having that little bit steeper head angle does help get the bike going exactly kind of where you want it. Where this shorter stature doesn't quite work as well as it would on, say, the Specialized Epic or the NS Synonym is obviously on those steeper, looser, more technical descents. Having extra length and a slightly slacker head angle does give that little bit more confidence, does mean you can push the tyre into a corner a little bit better. It gives that extra confidence because your weight is better placed through that front contact patch. That said, over the summer I have ridden a lot of XC tyres, and I've come away very impressed with the Maxxis Recon races that the Oiz is kitted out with. The Maxxis Icon is another classic XC race tyre, and if you look at the profile of that, it's very rounded. Now the Recon race is also very rounded, but it's just got that slight bit of shoulder on either side, and that makes a world of difference to the confidence, to the feel of the tyre in loose, rocky, muddy, dusty conditions. With the Icon, I'm always a little bit nervous rocking it over onto its edge and taking a corner, especially when it's mounted to the front of the bike. With the Recon, with plenty of volume, slightly lower pressures, and with that shoulder, actually, there's a fair bit of confidence you can have pushing it through those corners. I've come away very impressed with this rubber. All in, this Orbea Oiz M Team comes in at 10.2 kilos on the nose with no pedals, some tyre sealant and a tiny little splattering of mud, which is pretty much on par for other competitive XC bikes for the same price point. So how would I sum up the Orbea Oiz? But it's not one of the new school super radical XC race bikes out there. It isn't the longest, it's not the slackest. So on those steeper, more technical courses, you can tell that it has relatively traditional geometry. However, on those snappy, tight, twisty courses, there's plenty of reactivity from the back end, and being able to have the suspension working exactly how you need it is really handy. It sprints out of a corner very, very fast, and it climbs very well too. The Squidlock is one of those defining features of the bike, and I think Orbea have done a great job of allowing you to control the suspension on the fly. It really makes a difference with this bike. Would I race it? Absolutely. Would I do a marathon event on it? Yes, I would. And would I ride it just for a load of fun out in the woods? Yes, so long as it wasn't too steep. So that is the Orbea Oiz. I think it's pretty darn good, but it's not necessarily the best out there. Let me know what you think in the comments about Orbea's XC race bike. And don't forget to like, subscribe and click the bell icon so that every time we upload a new video, you get a notification.